Hi, my name is Scott and welcome to a new episode of the Simracing Guide. I hope you all practiced your corner exits last week, because this week we're gonna go over how a car's handling can affect your own driving style. Front wheel drive, rear wheel drive or all wheel drive, engine at the front, the middle or the back, DC, ABS or ESP on board, all of those things have an effect on a car's handling, and thus you should be able to adapt your driving accordingly. For beginners, this can be a very daunting process, but don't worry, after today you'll know exactly how a car will handle before even stepping into it. As we saw in the previous episodes, weight transfers and thus also weight distribution plays a great role in determining a car's overall grip levels. One of the heaviest compounds in a race car is of course the engine, so where do you place it to achieve optimal weight distribution? You can place it in front of the front axis, in the middle of the two axes or at the back. And as it's often the case, all three of these possibilities will have different positives and negatives. So let's look at each one individually so you can better understand what the consequences of each possibility will be. Engineers will always try to aim to get close to a 50-50 weight distribution for race cars, and the easiest way to do this is with a mid-engined car. By mounting the engine in the middle of the car, it gets so much easier for engineers to balance out the rest of the car's weight and create this sought after 50-50 weight distribution. Therefore, mid-engine cars will often have a rather neutral handling characteristic. Next to that, mounting the engine in the middle makes it easier to rotate compared to an engine mounted at either end of the body. Think about it like holding a hammer. If you hold it at one end of the handle and try to quickly move it back and forth, it will be hard to change directions. While if you hold it all the way at the top, moving it in all directions will be almost just as easy as if you weren't holding anything. The braking performance of a mid-engine car are sitting somewhere in between those of cars with front and rear mounted engines. Overall, mid-engine cars will perform well on most tracks and are easier to set up right thanks to the neutral balance. But while having a good balance is important, that doesn't mean there are no advantages to be gained by using a different engine position. When we look at front-engined cars, the benefits for everyday road car use are quite clear. Putting the engine, i.e. the weight of the car at the front, promotes a more understeery behavior for the car and thus a safer car for everyday use. Typically, putting the engine at the front also helps with managing space for manufacturers, but this is not really something that we should concern about if we are looking at performance. If we're talking about performance, then front-wheel drive vehicles will be the one that benefits the most about having the engine at the front. This is because the weight and thus the higher grip will then be placed on the front axis, which is the driven wheels of the car. Braking performance wise, however, this is gonna be the worst mounting possibility out of all three, as there will be even more load at the front during the braking phases, thus creating more strain on the grip and increasing the braking distances. Finally, if we look at rear-mounted engines, you will all have realized that placing the engine at the back gives rear-wheel drive cars more grip out of the traction zones, and that the braking performances are even better than mid-engine cars. On the flip side, rear-engine cars are prone to oversteer. Think of it this way: if you spin yourself around wearing a backpack with weight in it, the weight on your back is going to apply centripetal forces onto you, pulling your back into a wider movement. The rear-mounted engine is your backpack. Oversteer can be pretty difficult to handle for a new driver, so rear-engine cars should be approached with caution and a firm grasp of driving techniques. To summarize, front-engine cars will give the best performance for beginners as they tend to be more forgiving in their handling nature. Meanwhile, mid-engine cars will give you the best overall performance package, and then finally, rear-engine cars will be best if you go to a more twisty track, as they will have a more oversteery nature and will give you the best braking performance. But this all comes at the cost of a more tricky way to handle it. While talking about engine placement, we already briefly mentioned the driven axis, but let's go further into detail to understand how a car's driven axis can influence its handling. Front-wheel drive cars are the safest ones to drive. This is because they tend to understeer into the corners. On top of that, if you ever lose the back end to a front-wheel drive car, simply start gently accelerating out of the corner while turning to the direction you want to go to. This should help you out of your drift. Putting the driven axis at the front of the car does also have a bunch of negatives. For one, it puts a lot of load on the front axle, which has to do and the acceleration and the turning out of the corner. Another negative aspect is the fact that when you start accelerating, all of the load of the car is going to move onto the back of the car, which is the non-driven axis. This means that manufacturers can't put a lot of horsepower in front-driven cars as they can't efficiently accelerate out of the corners, making use of all of that power. Front-wheel drive cars are very safe cars to begin with, and they have quite a low barrier to entry for beginning sim racers. But don't mistake it, these cars are not easy to handle. If you want to use all of the potential of a front-wheel drive car, you will still need a lot of patience to find the exact right speeds the car can handle. Rear-wheel drive cars are great at dealing with corners as they have one dedicated axle for putting the throttle down while the other is busy turning the car in. It's important to keep in mind that rear-wheel drive cars need to be balanced well, as the oversteer can become very difficult to handle. On top of that, rear-wheel drive cars are the worst performing cars when the grip levels are suboptimal. Finally, all-wheel drive cars are the ones that can handle the largest amounts of power, thanks to the fact that the power gets transmitted to all driven wheels. Therefore, all-wheel drive cars are theoretically the ones that can accelerate the most efficiently. This comes at the cost of some additional weight and also rotational inertia, which can induce some understeer. The biggest difference you should remember as a driver is the way these different cars behave under too much acceleration. Front-wheel drive cars will understeer heavily when put under too much load. Meanwhile, rear-wheel drive cars will oversteer and send you into the wall if you're not careful. A four-wheel drive car will tend to understeer, but I wouldn't think too much about it, as all-wheel drives are not regularly used for track racing series. To find the limit of a front-wheel drive, you need to look at what the maximum speed is you can carry that won't send you into the grass. For a rear-wheel drive, you need to watch when you start drifting. Some people prefer understeer, others like myself enjoy a bit of oversteer. Test it out for yourself and see which car tickle your interest. We talked about traction control and ABS in previous episodes already, but let's quickly recap what it's all about. ABS is an electronic braking aid that will prevent your car from locking up the tires. Cars engaged in racing series that allow for ABS come with onboard systems that can be tweaked on the fly by drivers to adjust them depending on the conditions. ABS is technically always slower than threshold braking, but it can help brake deeper into turns, and in changing conditions like wet weather racing, it can be very helpful to prevent tire slip. Traction control, or TC, works in a similar manner as ABS, except it controls the power delivery, cutting off the engine electronically when tire slip is detected. TC is flawed in the same way as ABS is, providing little gains over professional human throttle application, except when poor conditions arise. ESP, or Electronic Stability Program, is a system that is rare to find in race cars but can be found on road cars. ESP prevents the car from getting tire slip by using individual brakes on the car to steer it in the direction intended by the driver. ESP works as an alternative to TC but has a stronger impact on performance as it is more intrusive on the car's behavior. Always remember that using any driving aids doesn't make you a worse driver, because although it might slow you down a bit, with safety comes consistency and thus a greater chance to reach the finish line. Next to driving aids, some racing series use other electronically operated devices to enhance the racing experience. Examples of such devices are drag reduction systems, DRS in short, or energy recovery systems, ERS. Always make sure to inform yourself of which devices a series allows and how these devices can be used in the most efficient way for maximum performance. Next to general manufacturer design choices, there are also very car-specific elements that will give you a great idea of how a car handles. One of the more prominent elements is horsepower, and if you combine it with the weight of the car, you'll get a great idea whether the car you're picking is more like a nimble track day Miata or if it handles like that boot that's blocked the Suez Channel. More horsepower doesn't have to mean you'll be faster though. You always need to look at the package as a whole. Heavier race cars will be trickier to handle in corners, and if you see a car that has little aero appendages, you can expect a tough car to handle. Older race cars use older tech and might suffer quite a bit of body roll caused by soft suspensions. Next to that, the tire technology has evolved significantly over the last 10 years, so expect less grip from those slick tires, if they are even slicks. Finally, don't be surprised by road cars struggling to turn, as manufacturers like to keep their road-going models understeering to prevent incidents. What I'm trying to say is that there are a lot of different factors that play a role in a car's handling. So when you first try out a new race car, make sure to take it easy and try and go find the limit at your own pace. Anyway, that is all for today's video, guys. Make sure to subscribe to the channel not to miss any of the future sim racing guides. There's one coming out every Tuesday of the week, and next week we'll take a look at how to effectively practice. I'll give you all of my tips to be as quickly as possible on pace. You can also check out the description down below, as all of my sources will be there, as well as some additional ones for you guys that want to improve even further. And then I'll see you space racers in the next one. Goodbye.